I have no advice to offer anyone who wants to be a poet, but I can tell you what W.H. Auden once said in general. He said that if some person came to him and said, I want to be a poet because I have something very urgent and important to express, the chances are he or she would not be a poet. But if they said instead, I am interested in putting words together in novel and unexpected ways, I like playing with words, with language, this is someone who might very well turn out to be a poet.
Welcome to Chapters, a literary bookstore. It is a great, great pleasure to welcome Anthony Hecht here tonight to read from his newly published 8th collection, Darkness and the Light. Please welcome Anthony Hecht.
I want to read poems chiefly from the new book, though there will be one exception that I'll indicate when we get to it. It begins, the first poem in the book begins in failing light, and the last poem in the book begins again in failing light, and there is not how long a sequence.
Anthony Hecht. He was born into a middle-class Jewish family in 1923 and grew up in New York City. Drafted into the Army in 1942, Anthony Hecht was among the first American troops to enter the German concentration camp at Buchenwald. After the war, he enrolled at Kenyon College, began writing poetry, and embarked on a lifetime career as a teacher. In 1971, he married Helen D'Alessandro, a distinguished interior designer. During these years, Anthony Hecht was the recipient of many honors for his poetry. Among them, the Wallace Stevens Award, the Eugenio Montali Award, and a Pulitzer Prize. Today, at 78, he continues writing and lives in Washington, D.C.
When I was a student at high school and even at college, I used to write doggerel verse. I did it because I enjoyed it. I thought I did it pretty well. And it was imitative of Noel Coward and the Gershwin lyrics, stuff like that. Never with any kind of sense that I was aiming in a particular direction. And indeed, I had no direction at all and didn't have to because I had to go into the Army. I was called up for service during World War II. And when I got out of the Army, of course, I had no professional direction or any sort of direction at all. But I had the GI Bill of Rights, which allowed me to go back to college. And I went to Kenyon College, and there I studied with John Crowe Ransom, a very distinguished poet in his own right and a critic and the editor of the Kenyon Review. And I started writing poems very much in imitation of Ransom's style of poetry. And he liked them, and he eventually got around to publishing quite a few of them in his magazine, which was a very celebrated journal. And while I was at Kenyon, somebody in the English department got sick. And they asked me if I would stand in and teach some elementary courses in English, which I was delighted to do, and I was being paid for it, and which launched me on my career as a teacher, which has supported me throughout my life. Certainly poetry wouldn't support anyone throughout any life, at least in modern times, because people as eminent as T.S. Eliot, who worked for a publishing house, and Wallace Stevens for an insurance company, that's the way it is. Poetry does not pay. It's pleasant to do, and it's very satisfying if you do it well, but it has a very small audience.
Then if being a poet was so difficult, why didn't you try another profession?
Well, I knew almost immediately that there were a whole bunch of things I could not even contemplate doing. I was not going to be an Olympic athlete. I was not going to be a Metropolitan Basso. I was not going to be many, many things. So it narrowed down to what I thought I could do and what I would enjoy doing. And poetry turned out to be something I felt a certain amount of confidence about. Not so confident that I knew or felt that everything I wrote was perfect, but confident enough to know that I did it a lot better than most people. I've written 8 or 9 books of poetry, from which I have made a selection of poems. Of these, the first is one called A Hill. It is principally set in a flea market in Rome, but the mind wanders, of course, as the poem continues. In Italy, where this sort of thing can occur, I had a vision once. Though you understand it was nothing at all like Dante's or the visions of saints, and perhaps not a vision at all. I was with some friends picking my way through a warm, sunlit piazza in the early morning. A clear fretwork of shadows from huge umbrellas littered the pavement and made a sort of lucent shallows in which was moored a small navy of carts. Books, coins, old maps, cheap landscapes, and ugly religious prints were all on sale. The colors and noise, like the flying hands, were gestures of exaltation, so that even the bargaining rose to the ear like a voluble godliness. And then, when it happened, the noises suddenly stopped, and it got darker. Pushcarts and people dissolved, and even the great Farnese Palace itself was gone for all its marble. In its place was a hill, mole-colored and bare. It was very cold, close to freezing, with a promise of snow. The trees were like old ironwork gathered for scrap outside a factory wall. There was no wind, and the only sound for a while was the little click of ice as it broke in the mud under my feet. I saw a piece of ribbon snagged on a hedge, but no other sign of life. And then I heard what seemed the crack of a rifle. A hunter, I guessed. At least I was not alone. But just after that came the soft and papery crash of a great branch somewhere unseen falling to earth. And that was all, except for the cold and silence that promised to last forever, like the hill. Then prices came through and fingers, and I was restored to the sunlight and my friends. But for more than a week I was scared by the plain bitterness of what I had seen. All this happened about 10 years ago, and it hasn't troubled me since, but at last, today, I remembered that hill. It lies just to the left of the road north of Poughkeepsie, and as a boy, I stood before it for hours in winter time. The origins and sources of my poems are many, and of course the most important ones are the ones from personal experience. The fact that I was a soldier in World War II, that I was one of the first Americans to enter the German concentration camp of Buchenwald, but they come also, of course, from literary sources, from the poets I've admired, both my contemporaries and the great poets of the past, from whom I have learned a great deal. And every once in a while, they come from dreams, of course, too. But they also, every once in a while, something comes out of the blue, and I try, if I'm able to, take notes on it, to scratch something on the back of an envelope. But if that's impossible, I hope that it will linger somehow or be able to be recalled. And if it can't be recalled, I don't worry, because then it probably wasn't important enough in the first place. I want to read a poem which is, in fact, a quasi-translation. That is to say, it's a version of an ode of Horace that was translated very beautifully by Milton once and very irreverently by me. It's called An Old Malediction. What well-heeled knucklehead, straight from the unisex hairstylist and bathed in Russian leather, dallies with you these late summer days, Pyrrha, in your expensive sublet? For whom do you slip into something simple by, say, Gucci? The more fool he who has mapped out for himself the saline latitudes of incontinent grief. Dazzled though he be, poor dope, by the golden looks your locks fetched up out of a bottle of Clairol, He will know that the wind changes, the smooth sailing is done for, when the breakers wallop him broadside, when he's rudderless, dismasted, thoroughly swamped in that mindless riptide that got the best of me once when I ventured on your deeps, piranha. When I sit down to write a poem, I use a pad and a pen, sometimes a pencil, but never a computer. I don't own a computer and don't know how to operate one. I start writing in longhand, and if I have to stop it before the poem is finished, as normally I would have to do because I work quite slowly, with lots of crossings out and revisions, and I can see when I cross something out what it still is because I can see through the crossed out passages, and I can make use sometimes of something that I've already crossed out. My handwriting is not good, so I often need to transcribe as quickly as possible from a handwritten version to a typewritten version, lest I come back to the poem the next day unable to decipher my own hand. But I normally only get a certain amount, a little bit of a poem written in a single day, so I take up where I left off with half a page typewritten and the rest in handwriting until I finally work my way down to the end of the poem. And this is a slow, laborious process, but one that is ultimately satisfying if the poem turns out to be any good. I want to read a poem called More Light, which contrasts two executions. One is, in fact, a conflation of several that took place during the Tudor period in England. And the second is an accurate account of what happened in the Buchenwald concentration camp during World War II, the details of which I have taken from a book by a man named Eugene Kogan, who wrote The Theory and Practice of Hell. The title of the poem, More Light, are reputed to be the last words of Goethe, who has a ghostly presence in this poem because the great German shrine of Goethe is in Weimar, and Weimar was the railroad station at which all the prisoners sent to Buchenwald were obliged to get off and march the rest of the way to the camp. Here's the poem. Composed in the tower before his execution these moving verses, and being brought at that time painfully to the stake, submitted, declaring thus, I implore my God to witness that I have made no crime. Nor was he forsaken of courage, but the death was horrible, the sack of gunpowder failing to ignite. His legs were blistered sticks on which the black sap bubbled and burst as he howled for the kindly light. And that was but one, and by no means one of the worst, permitted at least his pitiful dignity, and such as were by made prayers in the name of Christ that shall judge all men for his soul's tranquility. We move now to outside a German wood. 3 men are there commanded to dig a hole in which the 2 Jews are ordered to lie down and be buried alive by the 3rd, who is a Pole. Not light from the shrine at Weimar beyond the hill, nor light from heaven appeared, but he did refuse. A Luger settled back deeply in its glove. He was ordered to change places with the Jews. Much casual death had drained away their souls. The thick dirt mounted toward the quivering chin. When only the head was exposed, the order came to dig him out again and to get back in. No light in the blue Polish eye. When he finished, a riding boot packed down the earth. The Luger hovered lightly in its glove. He was shot in the belly and in 3 hours bled to death. No prayers or incense rose up in those hours, which grew to be years, and every day came mute ghosts from the ovens, sifting through crisp air, and settled upon his eyes in a black soot. Elizabeth Bishop and Richard Wilbur once had a conversation about how much poetry they were able to get done in the course of a single year. She had asked him that question, and he said, as he thought modestly, "I probably can turn out 10 or 12 poems that I'm satisfied with." And she replied, "Oh dear, I'm lucky if I get one." When I was a young man in my 20s, I came across in an anthology edited by Oscar Williams a poem by George Santayana called "A Minuet on Reaching the Age of 50. Wow, I thought, that's old. And I thought I'd like to write a poem celebrating my own age, but I never got around to it until I was 77, when I wrote a poem called Saraband, a much slower dance than a minuet, Saraband on attaining the age of 77, which has an epigraph by George Herbert that reads, "The harbingers are come. See, see their mark. White is their color, and behold my head." Long gone the smoke and pepper childhood smell of the smoldering immolation of the year, leaf strewn in scattered grandeur where it fell, golden and poxed with frost, tarnished and sere. And I myself have whitened in the weathers of heaped up Januaries, as they bequeath the annual rings and wrongs that wring my withers, sober my thoughts, and undermine my teeth. The dramatis personae of our lives dwindle and wizen. Familiar boyhood shames, the tribulations one somehow survives, rise smokily from propitiatory flames of our forgetfulness, until we find it becomes strangely easy to forgive even ourselves with this clouding of the mind, this sinuous blur and smudge in which we live. A turn, a glide, a quarter turn and bow, the stately dance advances. These are airs bone deep and numbing, as I should know by now, diminishing the cast like musical chairs. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. For whom? One is for him.
For whom?
Yeah.
Oh, how?
And one is for Ed.
Mark?
70th birthday party for Walter Boy. I'm an accompanist. And, he sent word.
Large audiences for really good poetry. It varies. It's. I don't know that I can think of that. Okay. Applause.